and thank you for joining. On today's webinar, we're going to discuss what you need to know about sales tax in the US. If you're a business selling to the US or you plan on selling to the US, it's essential to understand what nexus is and how and when you're required to register for sales tax. You'll also need to collect, file, and remit across the various states and jurisdictions. My name's Holly, and I'm a tax technology consultant at Avalara. I've worked in cross-border compliance for around 8 years now. I've been at Avalara for the last year and a half, and I'm joined by my colleague Dan. Together, we'll be discussing how businesses tackle US sales tax and sell into the US successfully and compliantly. Do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself, Dan?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dan Stevens. I'm a tax technology solutions manager here at Avalara. I've been at Avalara for about 3.5 years. Before that, I knew absolutely nothing about sales tax. So today's session, hopefully we can shed some light on the mystics that is sales tax. The rest of my life, I've actually been in technology, serving in software delivery, so background in software. So we can chat about that as well at the same time as talking about tax.
Amazing. Thank you. So before we dive into sales tax and nexus, Dan, are you comfortable telling me a little bit about some of the key benefits of selling to the US market? What kind of key insights your customers have maybe raised beforehand?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so the US market has a huge opportunity. Generally, in its size, as a business selling into the US, you have almost an untapped market with a variety of demographics. You also have a demand for international products. So if you look at the history of the US itself, they have a range of different peoples from different regions around the world that might want to buy, native products, for instance, Irish products, Italian products, Chinese products. So the market is a huge demographic for international trade. And to add to that, there are some stats, and I will read these off. Apologies for that, but there are some Act 24 stats that I'd like to add to here. So GDP is looking to increase by around about 1.5% this year. So that adds to the opportunity for that market. Inflation is continually declining, so we're expecting that to fall between 3.5% to around about 2.6%. And also, the US economy is currently outperforming the European economies. So if you are a European business looking to sell into the US because of inflation in the EU, this adds another little dimension to it. And the US is also the largest goods importer globally. I think it's around about $3.2 trillion worth of goods were imported in 2022 alone. So Holly, it's clear that the US market is a fantastic opportunity for companies wanting to expand their business. But truly to succeed, they must grasp a crucial aspect, which is US sales tax nexus. Now, are you able to kind of shed any light on what sales tax nexus is for a US business?
It's a very common question. Nexus is not often a word that businesses I speak to are familiar with. So it relates to a connection between a business and a state. So that can be an economic connection, reaching certain thresholds or numbers of sales in a state or jurisdiction, or it can be a physical activity, which can be a multitude of things. For example, having stock stored in a warehouse in a state, attending a trade show, having remote employees, for example. But when a business has nexus, whether it be economic or physical, they then have an obligation to collect and remit those taxes to the local state or jurisdiction.
Cool. So in terms of nexus, I suppose there's two different types, aren't there? There's a physical nexus and there's an economic nexus. So I think I'd like to kind of expand a little bit more on those type of nexus. So a physical nexus itself is where you have a physical presence in that state. So you as a business selling into the US and you decide to use a 3PL in a state, the chances are you'll trigger a physical nexus in that state and be obligated to register. The other nexus, which is economic nexus, is usually the nexus that catches most people out. And economic nexus thresholds can vary state by state. So as a business, you kind of have to view the US as 50 different countries crammed into one with their own versions on what they should and shouldn't be doing. So to give you an example, if you're selling a digital product and you're selling that across the whole of the US, there are only 19 states that actually tax that product. However, if you were to have an office location in one of the states that doesn't tax it, that would trigger a physical nexus. So it adds a kind of a level of issues to understanding those two nexus types. Oregon, Delaware, for instance, doesn't even have a threshold, but mostly from an economic perspective, states like Kansas will have a threshold of $100,000 or even 200,000 200 transactions per year. So that can catch a lot of businesses out. So if you were on a subscription model as a software business and you had monthly subscriptions, if you only had 20 customers in that one state, you would go over that economic nexus threshold. And another thing that catches a lot of businesses out is that some states actually include exempt sales in those thresholds. So it's a bit of a minefield. And if you're not up to speed with both physical economic nexus, it'd be worth speaking to a tax advisor or somebody who understands it in more detail. So one of the questions that we get asked quite a lot is, what do I do if I have prior tax exposure in a state? Now, as I've mentioned, nexus is quite complex and impossible for a business to manage manually. So it can't be ignored. And it is crucial to be compliant in order to be successful. So here are some options that we've kind of put together that you as a business can look at to check if you have nexus. And also to see what you can do once you have nexus. So one of the options really, if you have nexus, is to file back taxes. Now, back taxes themselves are usually available for a company if they file, if they have taxes for the last 90 days or 180 days or below a set threshold. Some states will allow you to file those taxes back to a certain period. The other option is something called a voluntary disclosure agreement. Now, the voluntary disclosure agreement, or VDA, as we call it, is an agreement with the state where you as a business would enter into agreement where you could petition for penalty abatement and the removal of interest of those back due taxes. And then in some states can actually have a payment plan to pay back those taxes. So if your liability is quite large and you've been trading for some period of time, a VDA is actually quite a good option for businesses to kind of reduce the liability that you have accrued over the period of time that you've been trading. An example of this would be a company that came to us a couple of years ago. They've been trading into the US for about 10 years. And they were a software business, and they assumed because they sold through a reseller model, which would be an exempt sale, and they also sold a few direct business to business consumer sales, that they would only have a handful of states that they would have to collect sales tax in. We did a little review for them, and it turned out that they had over $2 million worth of liability, which for the CFO, he kind of fell off his chair when we reviewed that. But the good thing is that Avalara went through the VDA program with him, and we were managed to reduce their liability by around about $600,000 worth of sales tax that was due back to the states, as well as negotiating payment plans with the states as well. So that's the options, that we have there. But Holly, are there any other options that we could use?
There are some other options. I would say probably not as safe as the ones that you've just described. But another kind of option that comes up when we're discussing historic compliance with businesses in regards to the US is potentially ignoring the historic part and registering and looking at being compliant going forward. And obviously, from describing that option, you'll realize there's some risk associated with that. What I would say is useful to know if you're considering your options and you've got historic liability is that as soon as you start the registration process with a state, one of the first things that the state will ask is, when did you start to sell in their state? And when do you believe that you've breached nexus? And obviously, we are in the nature of compliance, so we would suggest that businesses are honest on these documents and answer those questions accurately. And if you do, then there is that historic piece that's going to need to be addressed. So ignoring and registering and looking at the future only is a risk. And it's not what we would necessarily suggest as a sensible option, especially if there is considerable liability.
Of course.
And then the last option, which also does come up, is nothing. And obviously, what's the risk if you do nothing? And the main risk is obviously that your business is then open to audit. And some of those key benefits that you've just spoken about, Dan, in relation to VDAs, like limited look back period and avoiding the penalty piece, would
Hmm.
not be available if you were audited directly by the state.
That's
Um,
right. Yeah, that's right.
and I've had previous experience with other businesses that have mentioned, when they actually have to go through the audit process, it can be very expensive, hugely time and resource heavy. And so therefore the last option of doing nothing, it can be quite a expensive process if you were to be audited.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to jump on that and kind of talk about really from a business perspective. I think we looked at this as from an Avalara perspective, and I think the average cost of an audit for a business is around about $80,000.
Mhm.
So if you're a small business, that could actually stop you trading within the US.
Mm.
Another impact of kind of doing nothing really is the reputational impact. You don't really want to be paraded around on CNN or the news as a business that has been caught out for tax avoidance. The US take that quite seriously. One of the stats is that I think 35 to 50% of the state's revenue comes from sales tax. So the US do take it quite seriously, unlike in the UK where up to 20% is the revenue. But also, I think if you take away from a risk perspective, from looking at it from a business reputation, but also from a saleability perspective. Now, if you were a business that was looking to move to a merger or an acquisition, or if you're looking to list on a stock exchange, having historic compliance when a due diligence is run would reduce the value of your company. So as a CFO, you might be thinking, actually, we need to look at this and address this before we actually go down that path. And a good example of that really is a company I was speaking with a couple of years ago. They had a CFO who'd moved around quite a few times, and a CFO had moved from one company to a next and then another company, and hadn't registered for sales tax in the two previous companies. And the company he was with was looking to go in through a listing, but he was caught out by the taxing authority for previous sales tax registrations that he hadn't done for the two previous companies, and was then personally liable for the sales taxes due for those two other companies. So it gets really, really convoluted and a little bit confusing. So, I mean, just as a kind of word of advice would be, you need to stay on top of it straight away, especially if you're a CFO or if you're looking to go through an M&A or even a listing moving forward. On top of that, Holly, would you be able to share any advice for companies on what solutions there are available to support them if they think they have Nexus?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Avalara, offers an end-to-end compliance set of solutions for historic and future compliance. So there's a variety of sales tax risk assessments that we can offer depending on the complexity of the business and the model. And essentially, those surveys are designed to determine whether the business has got nexus in a state or jurisdiction. And then also, depending on the version of the assessment that we do, we can look at calculating the historic liability and looking at what the interest and penalties looks like too, which then gives the business a nice, clear overview of what next steps are really going to take place. Is it the best option for us to register and do back filings like you suggested? Or is the best option based on when you breach nexus and the historic liability amount that's due for a VDA to be considered? And then obviously we offer that voluntary disclosure agreement process as well. And we would consult based on the assessment, handle the voluntary disclosure agreement from start to finish. And then we've got the option to also support that business once compliant with their future compliance through our AvaTax software, which would integrate with your business systems to provide live, accurate tax determination at the checkout or the point of invoice creation. And that information would then automatically be utilized to populate your tax returns and handle the remittance. So we can really support from start to finish.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think before we wrap up, I think some comments that I'd kind of like to kind of reiterate really as a business, if you're looking at trading into the US or from Europe or wherever in the world you are. One is that it is a huge market. There are almost untapped potential for every type of business, but really to kind of look out at your product taxability, how long you've been trading, and really drill down and review that. And you can do that with a tax advisor, or you can enlist Avalara to help with that process. I think most of our information will be on the website if you need to look at that. But yeah, Holly, thank you very much. And everybody, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. Any final words, Holly?
Not from me, but thank you also, Dan. It's been great doing it with you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Our information should be on the slide should you wish to contact us. And we look forward to speaking with you all soon. Thank you.